Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 151, Boundary. The encounter with the other adventurer party had gone poorly, and MASH was waiting for Red to give them the reason for why. Jill and Luke were similarly giving Red some inquisitive glances. She could only take so much, and eventually Red sighed, seeming to pull the words out as she did so. It's because she was a Goldenwood elf. Her voice quivered with poorly hidden disgust, and her hands clenched into fists. Her eye grew a bit distant too. The response told him a whole lot of nothing though, and he replied sarcastically. Of course, Goldenwood elves, that tells me absolutely nothing. His words were a little harsh, but he didn't like how she seemed to have ruined their meeting for no reason. Red's shoulders fell at the words, but MASH didn't back down. Though he did give her a more apologetic look. Honestly, any reason would be good enough, and he was just mad because he felt completely left out of the situation. Jill rested her hand on Red's shoulder and that seemed to convince her to say more. Goldenwood elves are purists. Any mixed race is seen as filthy, and they are extremely hostile to half-elves of their own race. My family experienced a lot of crap because of them. Now, MASH felt a little bad about pressuring her to explain. He guessed that their dislike had been Safa's fault and that Red's mother or father was Goldenwood elf. He trusted Red, but there was still something that confused him. Why had Safa disliked him as well? How did she know? Is that why she hated me too? Red nodded her head. Yeah, my mother told me they have an inherent skill that lets them identify a person's race. She probably saw half monster or something. The way she spoke surprised MASH. She rarely made references to her family, outside of judging them as a whole. This was the first he heard of her mother. The information was shocking too. He knew that different races had access to different classes, but inherent skills were something he didn't know about. He wondered if beastmen also had some, but Luke shook his head in the negative as MASH looked at him. Even without a word being spoken, he must have understood the direction that MASH's mind headed. Considering what Red said, MASH tried to guess what a skill like that would actually reveal about him. If it worked like how he imagined, Safa had probably seen him as an abomination of many races, and he had no idea how that would present him to her. However, after hearing Red's thoughts, he didn't really care how Safa had perceived him. They talked a little more about the group and how the rest of them had seemed. MASH gave them his estimations of their relative strength. He hadn't thought that any of them was at a higher level than he was. They seemed strong when he considered the average adventurer, but he was confident that they were weaker than any one of them. In fact, he was fairly confident that just MASH or Jill could handle the group without much trouble. He told them as much, and the trip went by quickly. Quickly was relative here, and it had actually taken them almost 3 days of constant travel to arrive at the desert's boundary. They found it though, and MASH was glad to see that the entire world wasn't a desert. The distance to this boundary wasn't that large though, and more people should have been able to make it this far. It was an odd sight though, as the desert seemed to get cut off by a wide river. On the other side of the water, he could make out another piece of land and saw oddly blue trees. They were tall, each of them seeming to reach into the clouds above. It made that distant land seem all the more impressive, and MASH was eager to get out of the desert. Even from a distance, he could tell that the weather would be better too. Plus, it just seemed more exciting than an empty desert. Though he guessed that it wasn't completely empty. The sled moved towards the river. The sand limited his speed, but he managed to make it faster by giving the imitations of Priscilla some more energy. He was surprised when the first wooden snake collided with a barrier of some sort. It had been invisible, and it seemed to ripple at the collision. It didn't break, instead, it released some energy back towards the wood and broke the snakes into pieces. The sight was somewhat awe-inspiring, as it seemed like the very space seemed to quiver from the impact. MASH was surprised to realize that he couldn't sense the barrier within his domain and assumed that this had been what stopped most people. Instantly, he wondered if Jill could teleport them across, but she spoke before he could ask anything. Can't teleport through it. Nobody even had to prompt her, though it should have been obvious that she would have checked. It would probably be an instinctive response for her to check. Red scooped out a large portion of the sand beneath the barrier, but it didn't do anything to stop it. MASH grinned, excited to try and break through the barrier. Can I try and break it? Or does that sound like a bad idea? Sounds good to me. Jill sounded like she found the situation amusing and teleported a distance away afterward. She waved to him, giving him an encouraging thumbs up. Why not? Luke should be able to heal you. Red walked towards Jill, her voice trailing her as she moved. Luke nodded and followed Red, leaving Mash alone in front of the barrier. That was fine to Mash, as he was hoping to test his magic against the wall. Reaching a hand towards the barrier, Mash tested his anti-magic first. It was the most obvious solution and was surprised to feel it remain unaffected. Whatever the barrier was, it didn't seem to be made of mana. The anti-magic of the demons worked by dissolving the mana around him, and this barrier was obviously not a mana construct. Thankfully, there was no rebound from the attempt. If he couldn't break through it with anti-magic, he could always rely on raw power. He began entering his dragon form. It was unmatched in terms of raw power and he was confident in overpowering a barrier like this. As the transformation finished, he started creating lightning around his hands. It was as if he were preparing for one of the wide area attacks he had used earlier, but he kept the power tightly in his hands. Lightning lanced from his fingertips and the rest of his arms, bouncing along the ground. Maintaining his control on his magic, he pushed his hands into the barrier. The draconic claws managed to pierce the barrier, but it didn't break from that alone. The rebound from the barrier came surging up his arms and shaking his bones. At the same moment, he released the lightning against the barrier. Light exploded outwards, cracks forming along the barrier as he continued to push energy into it. The cracks stretched far, lancing through the entire barrier. He bet that even those on the other side would see the cracks. It looked like he was breaking the very sky itself. The rebound became stronger, and he saw his scales crack, and felt his bones break. Lightning and blood streamed from the cracks, but he continued to push against the barrier. The pain wasn't as bad as the worms from earlier, and he persevered. The barrier began to break apart, but that only made it use more energy in retaliation. Clenching his teeth tightly, he focused entirely on destroying the barrier. It snapped, shattering like a million pieces of glass. The lightning he had been pushing in front of him flashed brightly as it fired into the distance. It split apart into a branching tree of light as it extended into the sky. Mash slumped to the ground looking at the cracks in his hands. Blood was seeping through them, giving his black scales a red outline. Hesitating a little, Mash released the transformation, surprised to realize that he hadn't needed to activate Hunt. Well, it wouldn't have worked for this situation either way. A moment later Jill appeared beside him, Luke appearing beside her. He immediately began healing Mash. You do know that we can help with things like that. Even if you have the most raw power, it's not like we're weak. Well, Jill is a little weak but still. He didn't really sound all that bothered, but Mash realized that he was right. Instinctively, Mash took it as his job to handle things involving power, but there was no reason for him to do it by himself. As he thought about why he had done it by himself, he realized that it was a matter of pride. Probably an effect of one of his transformations. He had realized that some of his forms had affected his emotions. His pride was something that had grown stronger, and he needed to make sure to remember that fact. Warn me if you think I'm acting prideful. Sending the mental message to Priscilla, he hoped that she would understand what he wanted. She was an inherently prideful being and would have different standards than him. Even if she tried to understand what he wanted, he didn't think that Priscilla was the best choice for watching over him. There is no one else who would be willing to do the job. Not to mention that no one else can see into your mind. She was getting good at knowing when to be sarcastic and when to give him important information. He sighed, making sure that she knew that it was because of her antics. Mash wondered if she was picking up too many human tendencies and wondered if that was a good thing or a bad thing. She didn't seem to mind, so he let the matter be for now. Mash looked to see Red finally arriving. Jill hadn't teleported her, and it looked like she was ready to give them an earful. Mash looked around and saw that he had formed a small crater around himself. The sand had been pushed about, piling around where he had been standing. It had even happened on the other side of the barrier. Mash couldn't help but start laughing. Despite the damage he had done to his hands, it had been fun. Simply overpowering something that way was much more enjoyable than the slow investigation of the previous dungeon. The worms were annoying, and he needed to figure out how to get around their magic, but this was a lot easier. All he did was release his power freely, only needing to make it strong. The simplicity let him forget any of his more complex thoughts and just focus on a single task. Luke began healing him, and Mash felt the bones in his arms fix themselves. It was a warm feeling. Despite the movements of his bones, he felt no pain. He was glad that Luke continued down the healing path, as his arms were completely restoring themselves. Arg! Luke shouted the words as he released Mash's arms. Simultaneously Mash noticed foreign mana appearing on his skin. Letters of some kind seared themselves on his body. It didn't stop his domain though, and he could trace a connection into the distance. He only managed to raise a hand and point, as an arrow approached him. It entered his domain, and Mash instinctively tried to form a wooden shield to defend himself. Nothing happened though, and Jill had to catch the arrow to stop it from striking his chest. Mash tried to transform, finding that it wasn't working either. The weird text that appeared on his skin stopped him from doing so. His light show had obviously attracted the wrong kind of attention. His friends understood immediately and moved to block Mash from where the arrows had come. The fact that no more letters were appearing on the others probably meant that they couldn't target multiple people with it. Still, being able to stop someone's magic so completely had to be a high-level skill. This was a bad situation, but Mash couldn't help but smile as he realized that they had chosen him. Chapter 152, Trust Issues. If they had used the skill on Jill, the situation would have been much worse. This wasn't great, but he trusted that the others would be able to handle a small group of adventurers. The bigger issue was that he would need to defend himself without skills. Thankfully his draconic domain remained, and that would help him a lot in staying alive. Priscilla, if you can still use magic, try and break the seal. She sent me a confirmation and nothing more. Even she understood that this situation would get worse the longer this went on. Others would probably be drawn by the light show, and they couldn't deal with so many threats quickly. Maybe Jill should have just teleported them away, but she was a little hasty and teleported towards where the arrow had come from. Mash, Red, and Luke ran towards her. Mash wasn't exactly surprised when he saw who it was, but he was a little disappointed. Gerard was the first to peek over the dune they had hidden behind. He was followed by two others. Mash assumed the final two were probably distracted by Jill. Hopefully, she would be able to end her fight soon. Mash would probably need to deal with one of the people on his own. Having roughly judged their strength, he thought that he would have the best chance against Gerard. I think I can stall Gerard. He yelled the words loud enough so that even Gerard could hear. Hopefully, the man could get riled up and do something stupid. The man's expression didn't change though, and Mash got the feeling that this would be difficult. Red and Luke nodded, moving more quickly to engage their own targets. Before leaving, Luke managed to buff him, and Mash appreciated the boost. His stats were pretty high for his level, and he was a few levels above Gerard. With the boost, he would hopefully be able to make up for the lack of other skills. As Mash approached Gerard, he noticed the fight happening behind the man. Jill was clashing with Chloe. Or maybe that was Zoe. While they didn't look alike, the names were similar enough that he was a little confused. He saw Safa kneeling on the ground, obviously focusing on maintaining something. Assuming it was what was restricting his skills, he wondered why Jill didn't beat her first. A second later he saw the reason, as Jill did attempt to strike her. A barrier rippled appeared around her, stopping Jill's javelin from doing any damage. That was annoying, but he should have known that other people who managed to get this far would have some powerful skills. Mash's train of thought cut, like a blade sung for his head. Mash easily sidestepped the blow and tried to strike back with the palm of his hand. He didn't fancy the idea of punching through Gerard's armor. Just pushing him back would be enough for now. At least that was what he thought would happen. Instead, the armor flashed black where Mash impacted, and Gerard didn't retreat in the slightest. He swung again, this time in a wide swing. Mash ducked the initial swing, only to have it followed by a ghostly version. Thanks to his domain revealing the attack, he was able to react to the attack, and he stumbled back as the blade passed just in front of his stomach. The second that Mash stepped back, Gerard followed with an overhead swing. Since Mash was looking for it, he saw the ghostly visage of a blade following his current swing. Dodging the first swing, Mash tried to strike the phantom blade with his palm. He wanted to test how it would react and see if it was something he could defend against. As he moved to do so, the blade turned, the swing changing. It cut right through his hand. He had reacted a little though and managed to prevent the strike from completely bisecting his arm. Instead, he only managed to cut halfway into Mash's palm and remove a finger in the process. It hurt and Mash stepped back, as another swing came. This time Mash watched as the phantom blade didn't mimic his strike but went for another. As his real blade swung downwards, the ghostly blade came for a long horizontal swing. Mash rolled back, pushing himself onto his feet. Mash winced as sand entered his palm when he pushed off of it, but he quickly refocused on the man before him. How could he win? The first thing he needed was time to think, so Mash tried to come up with something. Why? What do you want from attacking us? Hopefully, Gerard would feel the need to answer. That would hopefully give him some time to think. Mash hid his grin as heard the response start, but he still needed to dodge when Gerard slashed diagonally. You guys are dangerous. Plus, we want your storage space and you nicely weakened yourselves. Obviously, he could attack and talk at the same time. Honestly, why did he even think that it would work? This time the phantom blade mirrored his motion. Mash stepped to the left using his good hand to push the real blade out of the way. The whole blade flashed orange, and Mash felt his palm burn. He pushed through the pain and shoved the blade aside. Stumbling back a step, Mash felt stupid for thinking that talking would change anything. Instead, now he got Gerard monologuing while trying to kill him. This honestly felt worse than the silent fight they were having. It's nothing personal, but we had to take the chance. You're not a real adventurer unless you're willing to take some risks. Mash was growing increasingly annoyed as he dodged swings. Hearing the man speak was becoming more annoying, and it only got worse as Mash took another injury. This time he had revealed another skill, the blade projecting a wave out with his swing. The fact that he hadn't done it before meant that there was probably some limit to the skill. Still, it surprised him, and even with his domain, he couldn't dodge it completely. He had needed to jump to avoid the attack but wasn't able to do anything about the phantom blade afterward. It cut into his thigh, but the wave the phantom blade produced was weak compared to the original. It was a cut, but nothing worse than that. Still, it caused him to crash to the ground. He landed awkwardly on his side, more sand getting into his palm. The pain only grew worse as he rolled down the small dune to avoid another swing. As he sprang to his feet, Mash spared a glance for his friends. Luke seemed to be doing fine against his opponent. He was fighting with Brock. Luke had already been buffed, but it seemed like his opponent had something similar. Brock was covered in flames, and he swung a flaming sword at Luke. Luke managed to block it with his axe, and Mash noticed golden flames crawling over his own body in mimicry of Brock. Luke would win eventually as Brock didn't seem like he was capable of healing his own wounds. Red was doing a bit worse actually. The twin who was a swordsman was quite skilled. Mash couldn't really see any skills on her but her strikes were fast and ruthless. That would have been a bad match-up with him in his current state. Red was struggling though, and even within the small glimpse of the fight, Mash saw her suffer 3 normally fatal blows. For her, it didn't do anything. She was the natural bane of any purely physical fighter, and it seemed like her opponent fell into that category. He was too low on the dune to see Jill's fight but imagined that she would be the first to win. The real problem was that not much time had actually passed. It felt like a while for him, but that was mainly because of how much he was struggling without his skills. In reality, he bet only a minute or two had passed. Mash jumped back as another swing came directed at him. Something was different though, and it took Mash a second to realize what. The phantom sword exploded when it was in front of him, and chains sprung forward wrapping him. Then it felt like he was being pushed towards the ground. It was like he was carrying an immense weight, and Mash struggled to step away as his body was sinking into the sand. He had to keep moving though. He was heavy enough to push some of the sand aside with his movement. Everyone always assumes I'm a swordsman or a knight. I'm a mage, just one smart enough to use defensive items and not rely entirely on my skills. Was he bragging? Did he actually think that beating someone after handicapping them was impressive? A blade swung down on his head and Mash was too heavy to move quickly. Instead, he raised his hand, trying to bat the blade away with his forearm. An orange flash was accompanied by the smell of burning skin, but he ignored it as he tried to block the phantom blade. He couldn't do much and attempted to catch the blade with his hands. Before he could do it, the phantom blade sped up, moving faster than the man's normal swings. Reflexively Mash tried stepping back and ended up falling further down the dune. The slip managed to save his life, but he took a nasty cut down his body. It started at his shoulder and cut across his body. This one was deep, and blood started staining his clothes. Mash decided that he hated talking while fighting. Mash needed to do something, being on the defensive wouldn't help him as much when his body was so heavy. He needed to take advantage of the situation somehow. He could try grapples or throws, either should be easier with his additional weight. Plus, it would let him take the initiative. Looking at the joints of the man's armor, another idea hit Mash. Push all my energy into the necklace and the earrings. Forget the seal for now. Mash was getting low on energy, and if Priscilla helped him burn through his energy, then he could hopefully last until Hunt kicked in. The added strength would let him deal with the weight, and it would let him surprise Gerard. Hopefully, going on the offensive would be enough for that. As Mash felt the earrings and necklace effects increase, he pushed himself to his feet and toward Gerard. The healing effect helped dull the pain, and the earrings helped him maintain his focus. Gerard was right, Mash should have been relying on his items more. His body burned as he made the motion, the wounds getting stretched as he approached the armored man. As Mash hoped, Gerard was momentarily stunned by the motion. Though he was too experienced to do nothing, and he swung his blade in an upward swing to block Mash. From watching the knights back home, Mash had expected this reaction. It was exactly what he was hoping for, and Mash stepped in and fell with all his weight on the man's elbow. There was a horrible crunching sound, as the man screamed in pain. The added weight on Mash's body made his attack even stronger, and the force managed to break the man's elbow. Expecting the phantom blade's swing, he had an idea of how to deal with it. He took advantage of his storage space in order to block the phantom blade. It destroyed some things within the space, but he didn't care. It was large enough to swallow the blade. Normally, it took too long to use a storage space defensively. Ultimately, he had guessed where the phantom blade would come from and opened the space preemptively. If the man wasn't so distracted by his broken arm, then he could have easily landed the strike. The man was clearly unable to resist the pain, and he was too distracted to react properly. Mash didn't stop, stepping in while pulling on the broken arm. The pain was obviously affecting Gerard and his reaction was delayed, letting Mash throw him to the ground. The man crushed roughly, sand getting pushed into his helmet in the process. Without hesitating in the slightest, Mash stomped with all his strength on the back of the man's head. Mash heard a crunch and felt the rush of a level up. Blood pooled around the broken helmet and the man didn't so much as flinch. Even still, Mash stomped again, spitting some blood on the man. Should have learned not to rely on items. Chapter 153, One Fight Ends. Mash muttered the words, as he trudged up the dune. The man had been a fool who got cocky because he wasn't able to use any skills. When was the last time he was in a real fight? It was clear that he was used to fighting with opponents, only after disabling their skills. It explained why the group had so much trouble against the worms. Even if the worms were a little tough, any truly strong group should have been able to handle it easily enough. It seemed like Mash's initial impression had been wrong. Anger bubbled up in Mash as he considered who their party had actually fought for their levels. With a skill meant to seal magic, they would be best against adventurer parties that were smaller than them. With how casual and confident Gerard had been, Mash wondered how many groups they had done this to. Well, at the very least he wouldn't be doing it anymore, and the rest wouldn't either. He slipped on the sand as the thought flashed through his mind. It took effort, but he stamped it down as soon as he thought it. Where had that heartlessness come from? Was one of his transformations exasperating his anger? What about his earrings though? There was a lot of energy being pushed into them. As he thought about it, only one thing came to mind. The earrings were treating the changes that had happened to him as a part of him. It probably treated it as a change he caused to himself rather than something external trying to influence him. That was a problem he would need to deal with, but he wasn't sure how. He would need to consider if there were things he could eat to balance his emotions. Those thoughts seemed a little strange. He would be hunting creatures based on their emotional profile, and that sounded wrong. As Mash crested the dune he had fallen down, he scanned the battlefield. The twin fighting red was getting tired, but her attacks still seemed too deadly to join that battle. No, Luke's battle would be easier to deal with. The man he was fighting was strong and the flames seemed annoying, but he wasn't particularly fast, and the flames wouldn't kill Mash quickly. Plus, he needed healing and only Luke could provide that now. Mash's hibernation skill would be locked like the others. He considered rushing Safa but didn't think he could break the barrier as he was. Jill couldn't and he doubted that he could. Hopefully, Luke had enough power to manage it. Mash ran through the sand, feeling the effort of pushing through his wounds. His hunt skill still hadn't activated, but he couldn't wait for it. Other adventurers might be heading here, and he wanted to end this fight before then. Mash couldn't make himself run at full speed though, the cut in his thigh protesting against the sudden movements. His necklace was mainly tending to the biggest injury, which in this case, was the massive cut that crossed his chest. When he got close to the fight, both Luke and Brock turned towards him. Both stared at him with a surprise for a moment, before Brock screamed at him. What happened? Where is Gerard? Dead. Mash didn't raise his voice, but Brock could hear his words. Luke could too, and he moved to take advantage of Brock's surprise. With a hefty swing of his axe, Luke cut him across the back. Brock ignored it and charged at Mash with a blind fury. He seemed to grow more muscular too, and veins became visible across his body. He continued to scream as he approached. How? You shouldn't have been able to beat him. Mash had to suppress a flash of anger, and he held his tongue from making a response. Instead, he focused on the charging man and preparing for his strike. Luke was right behind him, so Mash only needed to slow him somehow. He probably couldn't do it through the same means he had with Gerard, but he could manage something. Tripping him should be easy, but a better thought ran through Mash's mind. He set his feet preparing to dodge Brock's strike. While he did so he pushed aside the sand with his front foot, digging it deeper into the ground. Brock leaped into the air continuing to scream nonsense, while he raised his sword in a huge overhead swing. It was an attack that would only ever work against monsters, though it made his previous preparation pointless. He had been planning on making the man slip, but that wouldn't be necessary anymore. An attack like this would leave him completely exposed to Luke. As Brock's blade came down, Mash easily stepped to the side. Mash moved even before Brock landed, throwing an elbow towards his head. However, his attack never landed as flames exploded out from Brock as he landed. They were hot and strong, pushing Mash back while burning him. He was sent flying through the air, crashing and rolling against the sand. The tiny grains irritated the new burns that appeared on his body. The entire front of his torso was badly burnt, and the arm he used for the attack was black. It looked bad, and Mash felt worse when he realized that no pain came from it. He couldn't feel it in the slightest, but there was more than enough pain for him to get distracted. He found himself coughing and struggling to move. He pushed himself, using his remaining arm, to drag himself upright. The arm was burned, but it was still usable, and he couldn't stop some tears from falling as sand mixed with the burnt skin. He bit down on his cheek to keep himself from screaming, and he tasted blood almost immediately. While he managed to struggle to an upright seating position, he couldn't go any further. He could hopefully manage a roll and waited to see if Brock entered his domain. The seconds passed slowly, and Mash only got the strength to move when the boost from Hunt activated. The improved stats helped clear his mind and strengthened his body. He managed to drag himself to look over into the crater created by Brock's landing. Inside, he spotted Luke with a hand pressed against Brock's back. Neither of them was moving. Luke. Mash forced the word out, coughing as he yelled. His throat was dry, and his lungs felt burned. The heat from the explosion had done even more damage than Mash initially assumed. He needed Luke's help, and Mash grit his teeth as he pushed himself over the lip of the crater. Rolling down the sand was one of the worst experiences he had ever felt. The sand rubbed against his already burned skin, the pain shooting through his body every time he tumbled. He couldn't stop when he wanted to either and crashed into Luke's legs. Thankfully, that was enough to shake him from whatever he was doing. He turned his head slowly but snapped to attention when he saw Mash. Immediately, Mash felt the soothing flow of his healing magic and sighed in relief as his body began to heal. Mash shivered slightly as he remembered what had happened. He had made a mistake in assuming that he could handle anything that Brock had. The man was at a higher level than Gerard and would have been stronger. Plus, he had taken that attack head-on and suffered for it. Apparently, his wounds had been bad enough that it would take him a few minutes to heal, and he wasn't sure if they had that time. Leave my arm, for now, I can barely feel it anyways. Just deal with the skin, and we can go after Safa. Luke didn't seem to agree with Mash's words and protested vehemently. Your wounds are worse than they seem. I can tell how close you got to. Once we stop Safa's curse, I can do a lot more for myself with some skills. Mash cut him off, not wanting to hear where that was going. He wanted to heal and knew that it would be smart, but he also knew about the danger of lurking in this place for too long. Eventually, someone else would come, and they would be eager to pick the remains of whatever fight was here. Reluctantly, Luke nodded. That was good as Mash started moving as soon as he felt like he could. The pain was mostly gone, and he could manage well enough. Moving quickly, they got out of the crater. Red was still fighting, which meant that her opponent was probably the strongest. Although, seeing Jill's fight made it hard to tell. Both of the twins seemed quite strong, and Mash wondered why they would join a group like this. They seemed more than strong enough to handle monsters or dungeons. In fact, Brock seemed like he would have been fine in a normal dungeon as well. Ignoring the two fights, they moved towards Safa who was kneeling on the ground. Her barrier rippled around her, and she kept her eyes shut as she muttered something. It sounded like a prayer, but Mash didn't care to listen. She did glance at them though, her eyes going wide when she saw who it was. Without needing to be told, Luke began to glow brightly as golden flames wrapped around his axe. He swung his axe down like a divine smite. The blade managed to part the barrier. Luke's strength after all of his bonuses was quite immense, and Mash imagined he gained more from the previous fight. He knew immediately that Luke had stolen Brock's soul, though that was probably out of concern for him. Still, the new power only made his swing that much more terrifying, and it easily parted the barrier. He didn't kill Safa with the strike, and Mash repressed his urge to finish her off. The skill that had trapped him disappeared, and Mash relaxed as his skills returned to him. Almost as if to help him relax, he turned into his dragon form, feeling the rush of power as he did so. Oddly, he felt annoyance from Priscilla, but he ignored that for now. Safa had broken down into a mess, crying and begging for her life through her sobs. She seemed even more horrified by Mash's transformation and began spouting nonsense like it would change anything. "Please spare me. I had no choice, this is the only thing my class is good for. I couldn't do anything about my class. Why do you think I'm working with people like this?" She waved her hands gesturing to the twins who had stopped fighting. It looked like they had surrendered and approached the now crying Safa. They looked just as disgusted by her as he was. There was no point in acting like this now, the damage had been done and 2 people were dead. Plus, there had to be countless others that they had done this to, and Mash couldn't fully control his anger. "How many people have you killed? Do you think you have the right to beg now?" The voice of his dragon form was louder and deeper. The sound caused her to whimper and flinch away. The gesture only made Mash more frustrated with the situation. He couldn't just kill someone acting like this, it felt wrong. And if he did, that would make him worse than these people. Not knowing what to do in this situation, he just sat on the ground while speaking aloud. "Can you heal me, Luke? I think the fight is over." Mash sat down as he knew that the penalty from Hunt was coming. He didn't think that he would fall unconscious, not that he didn't want to though. His body ached and there was still a lot of damage across his body. Luke nodded, scolding Mash for fighting so much despite his limitations. Mash didn't have a real argument and let Luke heal him up while using his own meditation to speed up the process. He could carry the others and fly over the water afterward. That should be good enough to avoid any other adventurers that arrived. However, they still needed to figure out what to do about these 3. Chapter 154, Touching Base. As Mash got healed, he thought about what he wanted to do with the 3 remaining people. The easiest answer was to just kill them, but that felt wrong. Honestly, he just wanted to get rid of them as soon as possible. With how weakened they were, clearing the dungeon was no longer possible for them. He wasn't even sure if they could make it back on their own. Though he didn't care enough to help them with that. Turning to the others, Mash just kind of shrugged his shoulders at them. They seemed annoyed but similarly confused with what to do in this situation. "I got nothing, what do you guys want to do?" If any of them felt particularly about something, then he wouldn't stop them. He doubted they would do anything cruel. Red spoke, obviously still angry and glaring at Safa the whole time. "Let's take their stuff and let them go. They can figure out the rest." "That sounds fine, and more than a little deserved." None of the others protested, and Jill went to grab the 2 bodies and check them. Gerard had his skull caved in, crushed by Mash's foot. His arm was twisted the wrong way too, and the 3 girls turned to look at Mash with some genuine horror. They had no idea how to get his armor off. Thankfully one of the twins knew how, and Mash saw that he had a plethora of small magic items. Jill put most of them in his storage space. She also emptied the man's own storage space, getting mostly nothing out of it. There was some food and water, but it seemed like he was wearing most of his items. Brock on the other hand, actually didn't have any magic items on him. Even his weapon was just a normal sword. It was certainly strange, but maybe his class limited his use of items. It seemed like classes could be related to anything, so it sounded possible. Between the 3 girls, they only got a few useful items. Safa actually had some elven medals and jewelry that Red said would be worth a lot. While most of the items the 3 had were worthless to them, and they weren't in need of the money, they still took everything. They left the actual storage items with them and let them keep their food and water but took anything of value. The 3 were at least smart enough to keep their mouths shut. It only took a few minutes, but they managed to get everything and send them on their way. The real issue was needing to keep an eye on them as they left. Mash didn't want Safa to join another group but couldn't do anything more. If it happened, there was nothing he could do. He just had to make sure to not get caught off guard. Plus, he doubted that she would be willing to work with most people. Furthermore, not many people would want to work with someone like her. As soon as the three girls were far enough away, Mash turned into his cat form. He was basically fully healed and started forming wooden limbs to grab the others. I think we've been here for long enough. I'll carry us over the water. They could fly as well, but they were a lot slower, and Luke hadn't recovered that much mana. He had spent most of the time healing Mash. There wasn't any argument and Mash grabbed them with wooden limbs. Since he could control the size of his wings, he made them several times larger than normal. With his wind magic, he could easily carry the others and flew over the river. The water beneath zoomed by, and they noticed a few creatures lurking beneath its depths. Some were extremely large, easily surpassing the worms from earlier. What had surprised him was the change in temperature. As he flew over the river, the heat of the desert just seemed to vanish, and the air gained a pleasant coolness as they approached the forest. The trees were weirdly blue and rose far beyond their sight. Mash was tempted to fly toward the top but decided he could do that later. He touched down on the beach before the forest and saw that the other three were eager to wrench themselves from his wooden limbs. They seemed eager to explore the new land, and Mash was too. Honestly, the weather was nice, and the trees provided good shade from the sun. Plus, there were flowers and smaller plants scattered across the ground, making the forest seem even more magical. Well, this place seems better than the desert. Jills expressed what everyone had been thinking, and Luke seemed just as glad about the change. Even if the weather didn't affect Red or Mash as much, both were happy to be out of the repetitive and boring desert. Mash was somewhat hopeful that they would be able to find natives here as this place seemed much more conducive to a town or village. The question was how to find them. The others wanted to rest a little too, and Mash had no problem with that. While he didn't use that much energy in the flight, it would be a good idea to recover fully before exploring. They spent a few minutes just resting and recovering. Other adventurers would arrive eventually, but they still had some time to relax. Mash thoughts swam with a few disturbing thoughts, remembering Gerard and the bandits he had killed long ago. It had been a while since Mash had killed someone, and he couldn't help but think about it. Both people had deserved it and worse. He shook his head trying to move his thoughts to something else and decided to check his status. Name, Mash Stellumbra Class, Draconic Thunderwood Imitation. Level, 83-86. Health, 2090/2090. Energy, 3560/3560. Fortitude, 209. Endurance, 136. Strength, 171. Agility, 171. Intelligence, 220. Wisdom, 102. Charisma, 96. Free stats, 0-15. Skills, Hunt, Thunderwood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Monstrous Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation, Draconic Domain, Adaptable Monster Core, Monstrous Humanity, Wooden Body, Mimics Avarice, Golden Body. Mash was startled by the improvements. He had killed Gerard on his own, but the man was weaker than him. Gaining even one level from him would have been unlikely. Did killing him while having his skills limited give him a bonus? How did Safa's skill actually work? Could it have artificially made it so his level was lower? That didn't seem likely, but he didn't have another idea for how he got so many levels from the fight. It almost certainly had to do with the restriction, and he wished he had asked her about it more. Only one other thought came to mind, but he didn't like that explanation. He considered using his free stats but didn't know what to put it towards. All of his attributes were relatively balanced, and he didn't know what his class upgrade would bring. He probably should have realized this before, but it would probably be his next advancement that showed him how to use them. The obvious ones were intelligence or fortitude, as both would be generally useful for him. The bonus range on his domain was always appreciated, and becoming general more durable sounded good. Especially, considering the recent fight. He would think about it later. Luke, what did you gain? Ever since the fight ended, he had been wondering what bonuses he would have received. Probably some fire magic, but he was more curious to hear about his levels and stats. Luke turned to him, looking a little grim. Even if he didn't like what he had done, it was important to hear about what had changed. Trying to ease him into it, Mash told them of his own changes. I gained 3 levels. Don't really know how, but I guess it has to do with killing Gerard despite the restrictions. That did raise some eyebrows, as they realized how many levels that was. This dungeon was certainly giving them a lot of levels, and maybe that had also affected the fight. Wait, how close are you? There was concern in Jill's voice as she asked. He didn't understand exactly why, but guessed that she didn't want him to get ahead. That was a concern he understood. 86, so 14 more to go. The 3 of them looked a little annoyed at the level, but Luke's words revealed that he wasn't that far away. I'm at 82. I gained a lot from the soul. Plus, a good amount of strength. That was impressive, as he should have been further behind. Honestly, after the invasion in the capital, he expected to be far ahead of the others, but was surprised to see how close Luke was. He had stolen some souls in the previous dungeon, and the one he got now was enough to let him keep up. Jill and Red were a little behind, though it still wasn't as large of a gap as he would have expected. Jill was at 74 and Red was 73. They were behind, but it wasn't such an insurmountable gap. Especially, with how rapidly they had been gaining levels recently. Then Mash had an idea and couldn't help but share his thoughts. Curious to hear what they thought. Do you think it's possible that we are intentionally gaining levels more quickly? What if the system is responding to something like a war? Could the world owner be trying to give people more power? He was just sharing his thoughts openly, wanting to hear where they would go with it. With all the dungeons appearing, it could be possible. Though what does that make us? Invaders or defenders? Red's thoughts brought something to light that Mash hadn't considered. He hadn't been thinking about what side of the battle he was really on. It should have been something he considered, but he had been more focused on why he was gaining levels more rapidly. He didn't know how to respond to what she was saying, but he considered what options he was left with. What did he want to do if he was the invader? It was another concern to add to his list. Well, let's find the natives and try and help them. I doubt the other adventurers will be as friendly as us. We might be able to do what we did in the previous dungeon. At the very least, I want to try and help those that we can. Luke sounded surprisingly confident in his response, and Mash found himself agreeing with the words. Nobody had any real arguments for the plan, as it felt like a pretty good option. Plus, it was reasonable. It basically meant that they would give the natives the opportunity for a peaceful resolution. Even if they didn't have the authority to stop the invasion, they didn't have to fight for any side in particular. Mash should probably tell his brother of his speculations, but he couldn't leave the dungeon yet. The group actually had 2 ways out. Mash had the key his sister had given him, and they also had the key they got from Arthur before. Either item should be able to get them out, but it wasn't something he wanted to use just yet. Maybe once they found some natives, they could consider escaping and starting some more peaceful negotiations. With a semblance of a plan in mind, the group decided they had rested enough. Now the question was how to find people. None of them had any particular ideas, and Jill couldn't see anything with her skills. Since they didn't have any particular idea, they decided to just walk into the forest for now. Flying was an option, but they didn't want to scare anyone. Mash was really hoping for a friendly encounter. The recent betrayal left a bad feeling in his gut, and he didn't want to keep thinking about it. Chapter 155, The Forest of Blue. The forest seemed normal, with the exception of the oddly colored trees. None of them had ever even heard of blue trees. It wasn't impossible though, as colors seemed to vary wildly when magic was involved. He had seen several types of trees that had white or black bark. Those were no more odd than these. The tree's height was the more amazing thing. They pierced the clouds above, making it seem like the trees were stealing the color from the sky. They headed deeper into the forest, choosing to travel by foot in order to conserve energy and to avoid appearing threatening. The sun would be out for a while, but he doubted that it would get so dark that he couldn't see. Worst case scenario, he could rely on his domain, though that was something he did most of the time anyway. It took hours before they found anything interesting, and he only noticed because of his domain. That tree is hollow. Mash pointed to one of the trees, speaking and interrupting Jill. They had been talking about methods of completing the dungeon, and what might be required. Ultimately, they decided that exploration was the only option for them. It was probably a dungeon based around exploration, and there would be a portal out located somewhere in the world. There was probably more than one exit too. The people sitting at the entrance were probably waiting for someone to find it. Mash wondered how they would even know, but assumed they must have some special method for it. Mash could worry about them later. What do you think is inside? Jill teleported beside the tree, speaking during the teleport. It was disjointed and he couldn't tell where the sound of her voice was coming from, and that confused his senses. His mind was trying to orient the sounds and failing at it. She didn't actually wait for an answer from anyone. Raising a hand, she attempted to knock on the wood. Her knuckles passed through the tree. Shocked, she stumbled backward. Are you okay? Luke approached quickly, sounding anxious as he grabbed her arm. Mash saw the healing magic transfer to Jill. There wasn't any damage though, and she explained as much. I'm fine, was just surprised. Didn't expect an illusion. Mash stepped towards the three, pushing his hand toward and watching it in awe. It certainly could look like an illusion, but it wasn't. It's not an illusion. Here, look what's actually happening. Speaking with confidence, Mash continued to move his hand through the tree. The wood was perfectly bending around his hand as he moved it, but it wasn't a trick of the eyes. The tree was obviously a magical item, and it was designed to let things inside. The way it bent around his hands so perfectly was astounding. Jill appeared beside him, even if she could have cleared the distance in a single step. She stuck her hand into the tree, playing with it in the same way that he was. Soon the others joined them, and they just appreciated the magic of it. The near-perfect way it shaped around his hand just seemed impossible. So, what do you think it does? Mash considered her question but wasn't actually sure. The tree was large enough that he could walk inside if he wanted and thought about doing just that. He felt like something would happen, though he couldn't narrow down what. I think it's like a gate. It feels connected to a lot of things. She was looking up as she spoke. His eyes slowly drifted upwards, the others mimicking the motion. Red seemed concerned and held an arm out to stop Jill from stepping inside. I doubt it's going to be that dangerous. We should be fine. Luke spoke, stepping into the tree, and Mash followed his movements. Jill dragged Red inside, walking in with them. Red protested a little, muttering something to Jill. Mash normally would have been able to hear, but he was far too distracted with what he was seeing. The entire tree was hollow, stretching up far beyond their sight. Lights crawled up the walls, creating a beautiful spiraling pattern of green lights. All of them stood in the tree, and Mash was surprised to notice that it could easily fit them. In fact, it could easily fit hundreds of people inside it. There was writing along a section of the walls. At least, he assumed it was writing, though they could just as easily be pictures. However, they felt too systematic to be pure art. The letters were all connected and were obviously crude depictions of common things. One of the symbols was obviously meant to represent a tree, though he had no idea about the rest. Whoever had made this, clearly had a high level of understanding of the magic involved. Plus, the details that they had accounted for were interesting. It made him think that he found a good place to look for a present for his brother. And just get some useful items in general. Mash didn't feel anything magical about the letters, but after a few seconds, the floor began to glow. Jill didn't do anything, so Mash assumed that it wouldn't be dangerous. Light spiraled in, filling in the wooden ground in a spiral of green. The floor started rumbling, though it wasn't enough to make them stumble. A second later it started rising and Mash was surprised to see that he could look outside in some locations. It rose quickly too, almost as fast as his own flight would be. Even still, the trip would take a few minutes, and they contemplated what they would do once they were on top. This structure seemed constructed, and it looked like they would meet whoever had made it. There would be a language barrier, and Mash could only make a mental connection if the other person was willing. He could get his own messages across though and hopefully convince the natives that they came peacefully. To that end, Red started drilling him on ways to introduce themselves. She even told him to give whomever the natives' leader was a basic rundown of their abilities. Although, there was also a list of things he shouldn't mention, including some more specific aspects of their skills. The lecture felt far longer than the simple ride up the lift, but it eventually came to an end. He didn't expect the final piece of advice to involve a gift. She handed him one of the spare storage items they had gained. The adventurers had a few extra, though they were significantly smaller than the normal ones. Normally, these would open and close more quickly than the normal ones and were used to store weapons typically. He didn't know what to do if they had something similar, but they would cross that bridge when they got there. Even if the lecture had been long, the plan itself was simple. Finally, the platform came to a stop, and they were left in a room that would match perfectly with the one on the ground. The writing on the walls was different, but it didn't mean anything to them. Mash tried to get his best smile ready and stepped out of the wooden structure. He couldn't see anything with his domain but did notice that there was ground outside. It was weirdly lumpy but felt solid enough. His foot was the first thing out, and he felt it sink into the ground. At first, he thought he would fall, and prepared to form wings. He didn't need to as his foot stopped after a short distance. Feeling a solid ground beneath his foot, he stepped out fully. Breaching the wood, he got a good look at his surroundings. They had seemed empty to his domain, but a short distance away he noticed several beings standing behind shields. The shields were made of interlocked leaves rather than metal or even wood. Their clothing was also made out of intertwined leaves, but there were other plants mixed with them. The outfits were conservative by his standards, covering their entire body with plants. It hid much of their body too. All the colors they wore were bright, consisting mostly of a mix of reds, greens, and blues. However, their arms were completely bare. He just stared at them for a second, not fully comprehending what he was seeing. They were people, with human-like appearances, but a few things made them stand out. The first of which was feathers that hung from their arms like wings. They were brightly colored, each of them seeming almost intentional in the pattern that spread across them. Other than that, their bodies were mostly human, however, their faces were different. All of them had large, slightly hooked noses that reminded him of a bird's beak. Their eyes were unnatural round too, and none of them were blinking. One of the people in the back, a woman, he guessed by the slightly longer hair and more slender build. All of the people were on the skinny side, much like the elves back home. She was making some hand gestures, speaking in a language that sounded a lot like a song. While it was pleasant to hear, it didn't mean anything to him. He waited for the woman to finish, not wanting to interrupt her song. She seemed somewhat old with many grey hairs mixed with patches of black. It was long but tied into spirals that were tightly bound to the sides of her head and covered her ears. He decided to send her a message when he noticed her expression change. It was hard to notice with their eye shape, but it felt like her presence had become larger somehow. A closer look showed him that her feathers were flaring out slightly. The gesture was foreign to him, but he thought it was anger. He hoped it wasn't anything worse and sent the message carefully, not wanting to make it seem like an attack. "Hello, my name is Mash. We don't want to fight and are only curious. If you are open to conversation, try and reply to this. It should be like thinking but more intentional. If you're having trouble, wave. I can't use this skill to do anything dangerous." Priscilla had figured out communication between different languages and was actually sending her a version of his thoughts that she could understand. It was a little bit too complicated for him, but he could replicate the process by copying Priscilla. Well, now the control of the situation was in the hands of the bird lady. Waiting patiently, he saw the lady talk with those around her for a second. Some from behind her approached and whispered something. There was a lot of people gathering, and he even saw some children among them. Actually, he wasn't certain if they would be considered children here, but they were small and had the same features as human children. Seeing them, Mash relaxed a little. He doubted these people were warriors. That would be a concern if other adventurers found their way up here, but he had a few ideas for that already. If he created signs indicating that these people were peaceful, hopefully, that would be enough to dissuade wholesale slaughter. The previous dungeon they were in worked by a similar principle. He didn't immediately make a sign. It might seem like an attack, so he just waited for some response. Eventually, they had come to a decision and the lady began waving her hands in the air. Well, that wasn't a good sign. He decided to send her another message, hoping that it wouldn't cause any issues. "Sorry, I'm still learning how to do this. Is there anything we can do to get you to trust us? If there is, nod. If there isn't, wave your hands again." "Oh, but..." "Stop talking, I figured it out." Chapter 156, Reverence. He was shocked when she took the initiative in the conversation. There wasn't really a voice associated with the thoughts, and it reminded him of his first uses of the technique. Still, it was clear that it originated from her, and he wondered how she was replicating it. He was tempted to ask, but he was asked to stay quiet. She was clearly deliberating with someone, so he just told his friends of the situation. He spoke the words aloud so they would understand. "I think she figured out how I was doing the magic. She just copied it and told me to be quiet." His friends stepped from the tree, but they were holding their hands up in a mock gesture of surrender. The natives obviously knew of them and didn't react at all when they stepped out. Luke's appearance seemed to surprise them, and he guessed that beastmen didn't exist. which seemed ironic as they would probably be considered a type of beastman back home. His friends didn't say anything, and it took a few seconds for him to receive a message. You may refer to me as I fell. Mash, I would like some proof of your intentions. Give me a rundown of your abilities. Hearing the response, Mash nodded. Red had expected something along these lines, but at the same time, I fell hadn't asked about the others. I can tell you my abilities freely, but what about the others? The subdued response seemed to ease some of the tension in the air, and he thought it was a good idea to mention the others. He didn't have much time to think, as he received a response immediately. First, give me yours, we can discuss the others afterward. Well, that sounded fine. Red had wanted him to hide some things, but Mash got the feeling that that would be a mistake. They acted too trusting, and he guessed they had a method to tell if he was lying or hiding something. The description Mash gave them was fairly detailed, and he went over his skills and affinities. He even mentioned how eating things let him again a fraction of their powers and abilities. He mentioned Hunt and his domain, as well as his transformations. It took a while to explain some things, but he thought he managed well enough. Give me a display of your strongest transformation and let me see your domain. Not having a tone to her message made it impossible to figure out her intentions, but he obliged all the same. He sent another message before transforming though. His domain became harsher when he used his dragon form, and the form itself was quite horrifying. Just be aware that the transformation is quite scary. Also, my domain is mostly undetectable, but you can feel it if you walk inside. Sorry, I don't know of any other way. Mash was trying to be as sincere as possible and hoped that his honesty would work. He honestly didn't mind these displays or even revealing the information. Even with them outside of his domain, he had a good idea of how strong they could be. They were obviously skilled when it came to magic, but he was still confident that his dragon form would be enough to handle them. Knowing about it wouldn't change anything. Fine, I shall step forward. Begin your transformation. Mash did so, still a little worried as there were still children outside. Well, hiding it at this point would only cause more issues. As he began his transformation, thick scales formed over his body. Wings expanded outwards to make him seem as formidable as he felt. He immediately withdrew his wings, realizing that he had let his pride get the better of him. The form seemed to make him want to display his strength. As his transformation finished, Mash felt his stomach drop as the people in front of him dropped to one knee. Some began muttering something, I fell included. Even the children had taken up the position, their parents had likely forced them to do so. Even without much knowledge, he understood prayer when he saw it. He had an inkling of what was going on but still hesitated in sending the message. What are you doing? Mash was able to convey tone in his messages and didn't hide his exasperation from it. I fell twitched upon receiving the message but didn't move from her position. If anything, she seemed even more reverent as she replied. I apologize for not recognizing one such as you. To be graced by the presence of one of the lords. I have acted foolishly and beg you to spare these unknowing people. Mash had an idea of what she was talking about, and it annoyed him. He wanted to ease their tension but also confirm his suspicions. Priscilla, send her an image of the dragon I saw. He wanted to make sure that she was referring to that being, and not something that literally looked like he did now. While he was dragon-like, he was still humanoid in shape. A true dragon was less humanoid and more monstrous. Is this what you refer to as a lord? And please rise, I will not harm anyone. I was genuine in my intentions. There was almost no delay in her response. She rose quickly, commanding those behind them while sending him a message at the same time. It was obviously overzealous, and he had to contain his sigh. He did dismiss his transformation, and that seemed to let some people relax. Yes, that is one of the lords. My lord, may I inquire into your goals here? Mash took a while to respond to her. He was considering what her reply meant with his greater understanding of dungeons. Her confirmation indicated that dragons were beings beyond a single world. It should have been obvious. They were all powerful beings that flew above the realms of man. He should have assumed that they would be able to go between worlds, but he didn't know why they would. He doubted these people would know, but he would look into their religion when he had the opportunity. The question he was considering was how to deal with the situation. He didn't want to be treated like this. However, he realized that he probably could talk to the others without any worry. It didn't seem like these people would attack them. He turned to his friends, realizing that they were looking at him with unhidden annoyance. Look, I had no idea this would happen. Rather than glaring at me, do you have an idea of what I should do? This whole situation was bothering him, and it would only get worse. Mash looked towards Red as her plan had basically been ruined. Hopefully, she could come up with something else. Well, just tell them the truth. We are looking for a dungeon exit and wanted to learn about their people since they had the chance. Maybe see their inventions and magics. Oh, and see if they have something to let us communicate. Jill was the one to speak up, stopping Red from giving her advice. Mash thought that was good enough and sent a message to Eiffel. Hopefully, she would have something so that Red could take over the conversation. He wasn't designed to handle a situation like this and would be glad to push the responsibility to someone else. We just want to learn about your people and magics and find a way out of your world. Also, do you have anything that can let my friends communicate with you guys as well? Eiffel rubbed her chin in contemplation. She seemed eager to fulfill his demands, and it made him feel incredibly uncomfortable. At least, it didn't look like there would be a fight with these people. Yes, I believe I can manage something. If you follow me, it should only take a few moments. Curious more than anything else, Mash started walking towards Eiffel. He motioned to the others, and they followed him. In his mind, he couldn't help but consider if this was all an act, and they were walking into a trap. He couldn't help but feel a little distrustful after recent events. However, his experiences had shown him that the people of other worlds tended to be better than his own. They followed Eiffel, surprised to see that nobody else was coming. He expected her to have the guards from earlier following them, but she seemed confident in what she was doing. After passing a bit away from the tree, Mash felt a barrier appear at the edge of his domain. Once they walked through it, he realized that it was an illusion. It had hidden the city that surrounded the tree. It was filled with large wooden structures, and Mash wondered how the clouds could support such structures. The buildings were tall, dozens of windows scaling the front of the building. How many floors did these buildings have? They were built tall and squished tightly together. The buildings seemed impossible and highly risky. What happened if one of them got destroyed? Hundreds would die from something like that. At first, he believed that there couldn't possibly be that many people here, but the streets were crowded and many of the windows were open with people looking down at them. Everyone seemed like they were trying to catch a glimpse of Mash, which made his skin crawl. He tried his best to follow Eiffel while ignoring the stairs and focusing on the incredible design of the city. The others were just as amazed, and he was certain that they would have some unique things that would be worth taking back. Eiffel eventually stopped in front of one of the large buildings and led them inside. The inside of the building was a mostly empty space with a large spiraling staircase in the center. Rather than taking the stairs, she led them around the nearest corner into a much smaller room. The main entrance let them look up and see the incredible wooden structure for what it was. It wasn't as big as the trees but was around half as tall. The staircase obviously climbed up the whole structure, and he saw another of the moving platforms at the center of the staircase. He didn't bother counting the floors but knew it was a lot. The ceiling was covered in the same green lights that had been used in the tree. Her workroom was fairly large, and there were a countless number of small instruments spread across the walls, hung on small hooks as if they were on display. However, she grabbed none of those, instead just grabbing a sheet of paper, and what looked like a black stone. With the way she held it, he could tell that it was used for writing. "This is my workstation. I should be able to manage something. However, I will need some help from you, Lord Mash." That address made him wince. He decided he never wanted to be called Lord Mash ever again. The very thought of it caused his body to tense up. He would have yelled his response if he could but just sent her a message. "Please just call me Mash, and yes, I will be glad to help with whatever." What happened after that was rather mundane. She asked him about how his language worked. He explained the letters and word construction, sounding out some words when she asked for them. The whole process probably took a half hour at most. By the time he finished, Eiffel had managed to speak the language. It wasn't perfect but was still an incredible display of her understanding. "You learned that quickly. Is that something all of your people can do? Is that how you replicated my magic?" Chapter 157, Different Talents. After teaching her his language, he grew more accustomed to the slightly reverent looks she kept giving him. During the process, he realized that Eiffel had to be a genius. She picked up their language quickly and it had taken even less time for her to copy the mental magic. He wondered if all the people of this race were as capable as her. "You learned that quickly. Is that something all of your people can do? Is that how you replicated my magic? The question was merely to satisfy his curiosity, but she gave him a weird look. It was obviously a question she didn't want to answer. The look on her face said that she would give him a reply anyways, and he considered stopping her. His curiosity won out though, and he waited for the response. We have a talent in replicating magic. But yes, I am considered to be talented. She wasn't offended, that much was obvious by her tone. Her voice sounded sadder, and the words felt forced out. Mash knew what that was like. It was something someone could only manage when talking about a past they didn't want to remember. Instead, he just moved on to the real reason they had moved to her workshop. Are you going to make the items now? Could we watch? He was curious to see how the items would compare to the ones back home. Plus, he wanted to know if it was something he could learn. While he probably wouldn't have the time to practice, he could possibly teach the skill to others. Maybe, even alter an existing item. Yeah, I would like to learn about your magic items too. We have a pretty big wedding coming up and want to find a good present. Jill spoke aloud, sounding relieved to be able to speak with someone. The others had been forced to take a back seat while Mash handled most of the conversation. Soon, they would be able to talk with others. However, when Jill brought up the wedding, that prompted Eiffel to ask about it. It took a few minutes to explain what it was, and she said they had something similar, though they called it a joining. While she had learned the language quickly, much of it was due to her intuition. She had learned most of the language by understanding the intentions behind Mash's words, and the item she made would do something similar. After finishing her discussion with Jill, she started working on the item. He was surprised to grab a thick leaf. It was a little bigger than his arm. She grabbed a metal knife, though it was shaped oddly. It was like a pen, but the end was more curved and wider than the shaft. She used it to cut into the leaf and then filled it with what looked like liquid mana. He had tried manifesting raw mana like that but had been incapable of it. Only skills or affinities let him manifest his mana outside of his body, and never in its raw state. Normally manifesting mana as something like that is considered impossible. This is something worth taking. Mash knew that she wasn't talking about stealing it by eating someone, but the thought still passed through his mind. Priscilla knew that he wouldn't eat people willingly, and she was only talking about learning it as he did with the golden body. However, his mind couldn't help but think about the other method, but he pushed it away. That was something he was not willing to succumb to. He watched carefully as she worked, using his domain to understand what she was doing with her mana. It reminded him of what he did back when he was a child, but it became a lot more complicated once it left. It almost felt like she was pressing her own mana together, pushing it until it naturally changed form. The amount of mana control to manage something like that was impressive, but he was more interested in what came after. She used it to fill in the cuts she made on the leaf, and the motion was incredibly fluid. The writing was a flowing continuation of pictures, only a few of which he could recognize. He saw one that looked obviously like a flower, and another that resembled the tree from earlier. There were a few more that he knew. All of his friends were also watching the process, and he noticed Jill looking extremely carefully. Did you notice something wrong? Try responding in your mind. While he did somewhat trust that this woman wouldn't harm them, he knew his intuition wasn't always the best. Jill might have noticed something he hadn't, and he sent her a message just in case. Shaking her head slightly, he was glad to realize that his magic was working as he intended. No, it is just impressive. I was wondering how my mother would compare. Mash had forgotten that Jill's mother was able to enchant magic on items. He didn't know who would be considered better, but it was really a competition. Still, he wondered how these items compared to the ones back home. The fact that Jill was comparing Eiffel to her mother said a lot, especially considering how seriously her mother had been treated by the royal family. Eiffel would probably be considered a genius. After a short while, she finished 4 copies of the item. Each of them received one, and he felt a little bad for making her work for essentially nothing. Hopefully, he could convince the others to give them something. However, he wanted to see what items they already had before deciding what to give them. They had gotten a bunch of random items from the previous fight and one of them would hopefully be good enough. He watched the others equip the item, another one of Eiffel's people getting called to test its capabilities. While the others could easily attune and unattune to items, he wasn't quite as blessed as they were. He needed to be careful about what items he attuned to, and he wasn't sure if this would be worthwhile. There was no strict limit to the number of items someone could attune to, but a person shouldn't place different attuned items right next to one another. He already had an item around one wrist, his neck, and both ears. There were still plenty of locations to include items. Jill's armor covered most of her body, although she was considering getting rid of it. She mostly relied on her skills to avoid attacks and didn't need it anymore. However, she didn't need to do that yet and only moved one of her anklets to stack atop the other. It was a bit weird to see 2 bracelets on one wrist and 2 anklets on an ankle, but it did open up some space for her to put the item around her free ankle. Eiffel had said that her people were known as Vians. Watching his friends speak with the Vian was enlightening. It sounded like they were somehow just talking while ignoring the concerns of language altogether. He turned to Eiffel, who was recording some things while watching the interaction. Will this work with any languages or just the 2? Mash saw her expression grow dimmer, and he realized that the question must have seemed like a criticism. He quickly corrected himself and explained his hesitation. What you did here is pretty amazing, and I'm not asking because I'm disappointed with the results or anything. I can only attune to so many items, and each one that I do becomes a permanent addition. So, I need to be more careful with it. He motioned to visible flower tattoo beneath his ears and arm. She looked at him seeming to understand. Frowning a little she replied. No, I think this only works with Enbik and Lynch. I might be able to do something though. Enbik was the native language of her people and her mind seemed to be coming up with a solution even before he could say anything. He decided to be a little greedy and let her try and come up with a solution. Well, it wasn't something he needed urgently since he could handle most conversations just by using his mental magic. He left the item she had just made, deciding that he would wait for something better. Seeing as it only took her an hour or 2 to make those 5, he bet that she could probably manage something. Since they had the items that they wanted, the next step was just to look around the city. Hopefully, they could find some interesting things. Before he left though, he thought about something else. Eiffel, other adventurers might visit this city and any others your people have. I recommend having more of these items ready. Plus, put this up in front of the elevators. And, as much as I hate to admit it, my people are pretty dangerous and cruel, so be careful. As he offered his advice, he formed wooden signs that essentially described the Vians as allies. It told the adventurers not to attack them. It was all he could think of to try and dissuade them from attacking blindly. Honestly, Mash didn't know who would win in a fight like that but didn't want it to happen. However, he had recently been shown the greed of his people and felt like it wouldn't do much to stop them once they saw the actual cities. Well, maybe the Vians could come up with a way to deal with them if it came to it. At least, they would have a little warning now. They didn't stay in Eiffel's workshop the whole time. It took some prompting, but she decided to help them look around the city. There were a few things they were curious about, and the most relevant of which was to find a place to stay for the night. Eiffel was tempted to keep working on the new item, and it was clearly something that she was excited to work on. However, she was more eager to make sure that he was introduced to the city properly. Even if she was willing to acquiesce to his request of not being called Lord, it did not mean that she wouldn't treat him like one. He would need to get used to his draconic transformation causing strange reactions in people. It was a significant power, and the way it altered his race was equally important. Walking through the city showed him that much. Several people followed them from a respectful distance, and many others would bow respectfully as he passed. He found himself shivering whenever it happened. It got to the point where his friends joked about him being cold. Other than the people's strange gazes, he was glad for the tour. The city was enormous, and the buildings all doubled as stores, restaurants, and homes. Essentially every tower-like structure was like a small town. The first 3 floors consisted of workspaces and other commercial buildings, while the upper floors contained homes. Each of the rooms had exits to the outside directly as every person in the city could fly. He should have expected as much from their wing-like arms, but it had still surprised him. It didn't take long for Eiffel to lead them to a building with spare rooms. She obviously wanted to keep an eye on them and got them rooms near her own. It was obvious that she was a leader of some kind, but he wondered what the exact nature of her position was. She was obviously a skilled crafter, but that wouldn't be enough to become a leader. As he considered it, he realized that it might be enough. He was unconsciously pushing his own expectations onto the people he met, but their society could be established on entirely different fundamentals. Maybe crafting ability was the most important thing to these people. Considering all of the magic items he had seen, it was certainly a possibility. Chapter 158, Flying City of Asborn. After receiving a place to stay, Mash's initial instinct was to go and explore the town. He still had his mask and could disguise himself but doubted that it would do much. They would stick out regardless of what he did. They had made a pretty large commotion when they arrived at the city and still needed to handle the after effects of that. So, he didn't go outside immediately, wanting to let the situation cool down instead. The fact that he wasn't going out seemed to relax Eiffel. She didn't leave though, taking the opportunity to lecture them. None of them minded, and Red actually insisted that she go into more detail. Eiffel responded in kind, making sure everyone understood the rules of the city and some of its history. The city was known as Asborn and originally it was much lower to the ground. The city had actually been built atop trees in the past. Slowly the trees grew and carried them into the sky. The story described how the trees had changed from being normal to what they were now. The wood turned blue, and the leaves became clouds manifest. Strangely enough, the leaves that they pulled from the trees returned to being leaves and were the basis of most of their magical items. The tree itself had naturally high mana densities, and every leaf was good enough for basic magic items. It was also what enabled them to become such magical creations like the moving platform they had ridden to arrive at the city. Learning of the story of the city was enlightening, but it had been the introduction of the lords that truly surprised them. As Eiffel continued the story, Mash got invested in the story. A dragon's power was rarely mentioned back home. Everyone there had a fear that the sheer mention could provoke the creature's wrath. Eiffel's people revered them, and hearing the end of the tale, he understood why. Nothing could stop the tree's growth, and eventually, it became dangerous for the people to live atop them. Soon, the people would either have to flee or die as the city became inhospitable. That was when a group of dragons had arrived. Each was a master of the winds and owned the skies. However, they did not punish the people for approaching their territory and instead aided them in their plight. One of the dragons bound the trees to the world below, stopping them from growing any further. Another bestowed the trees with power, granting them the ability to grow fruit and provide for a city. The final dragon granted the people a small portion of their power, allowing them to live atop the trees. As it had turned out, the Vians believed that they had not always had wings and had been gifted them by the dragon. It had changed their people, turning them into what they were now. They were free to roam the skies but were careful to never encroach on the skies of the dragons. Instead, they flew across the sky below, using the ground beneath for additional resources and food. Hearing the story was fascinating, but it felt like nothing more than a story. That was the end of the story but the start of another discussion, and Red had started asking her about other things. Rules and things they should and shouldn't do. Bad-mouthing the lords would earn them imprisonment or execution depending on what was said. Only a lord could pardon someone for that crime. Ultimately, the rules all boiled down to be a generally good person. Nothing was too offensive or controlling, and he thought that the rules were well designed. Enforcement was cold and unforgiving. The lords were the only ones that could pardon someone, and Mash highly doubted that there was a precedent for that. He bet that nothing could make a dragon do anything, let alone pardon someone. The strange part of the rules was the fact that Mash was essentially allowed to do whatever he wanted, which extended to his friends as he could pardon them of any crime. It also explained why Eiffel had felt no need to worry about costs in aiding him. Honestly, he doubted that he could do anything to make his stay here normal. The lectures had gone on for hours, and they were finally relieved at dinner. Eiffel referred to dinner as night food. It was simple nomenclature, but he actually liked it more than how they made names for every little thing. Well, what do you guys want to do tomorrow? They had already decided to spend the rest of the night relaxing, and he wondered what they wanted to do first. While he wanted to check out magic items to find a present for his brother, the others might want to find a way out first. It was a concern that he should probably take more seriously, but he had the key that his sister had given him and the monsters here were a relatively high level. Leaving was not on the top of his list. I kind of want to check out the concert halls that she mentioned. If their language is naturally melodic, I'm curious to hear their music. Hearing Luke's words, Mash smacked his own forehead loudly. He had completely forgotten about enjoying his stay and had been constructing a list of things he could do to be productive. Who knew that it would be so hard to relax? It sounded like such an impossible concern, yet he found himself constantly trying to make the most of his time. He knew that his childhood had been strange, and this was just one byproduct of it. Yeah, that sounds a lot better than what I was thinking. None of them tried to pry more from Mash's response. They could probably have guessed what he was thinking. Feeling a pat on his back, Jill spoke from beside him. Her words reminded him of something that he hadn't thought about. Well, how about we finally try using those harmonicas? I think I can teach you some of the basics of music. Plus, I think Eiffel would enjoy it as well. The person in question had been following them from a small distance away. She looked up suddenly, turning away from a sheet of paper in her hands. Apparently, she had been working on something while walking, and a quick glance at the sheet told him that it was probably the item that he wanted. Feeling a little bad about that, he added to Jill's comment. Yeah, I think you will really like the harmonica. It's a fun little instrument. Also, you don't need to rush on that. Her eyes went wide, as she glanced between the paper and his group. She quickly tucked the paper into a fold of her dress. Her clothes were made of leaves and Mash realized that many of the seams were actually pockets. He wondered how many different things she carried on her and decided that he could do with some clothing like that. It just seemed very convenient. I would love to learn of the music of your people. A lord's taste must be immaculate. Mash stumbled hearing the words fully. He definitely couldn't meet those expectations and turned to face the Vian. His look must have given something away because she started laughing, speaking through the chuckles. That was a joke. I heard. You guys mentioned that you were learning. Her words came out irregularly, as she struggled to keep her laughter in check. Mash stopped and just looked at her. The others did likewise. None of them had been prepared to hear a joke from her. The reverent looks she had been giving him lessened during the lectures, but he was surprised at how normal she acted now. You got a lot relaxed, was really not ready for that. Jill spoke for them, her words articulating how they all felt. Eiffel looked at them like they were fools. Her expression slowly shifted to realization, her explanation coming out quickly afterward. Night has fallen, and the darkness will hide me from the light. The day is where the world can see us, and the night gives us the blessing of silent freedom. One to make us diligent, another to provide us with reprieve. The words sounded extremely rehearsed, and it was obviously something they believed wholeheartedly. This sounded like it meant that she was free to relax, now that the sun was down. While he didn't know how this world worked, he didn't think that the sun and moon did anything special here. Their ancestors had probably just given it meaning to make their people more productive. Still, he was glad to see Eiffel relax, even if it was for a ridiculous reason. Then he considered what this would mean if he went out at night. Would he be free of the reverent treatment he had received thus far? Wait, does that mean you guys won't treat me specially? Mash couldn't hide the eagerness from his voice, but Eiffel just responded quickly. It would not be as severe as during the day, but nothing would open at such a time. Nobody would be caught working after the light has turned away. Eiffel made it sound like the very idea was blasphemous. So, working at night was just as bad as relaxing during the day. He didn't know what to think about that. He remembered his schedule as a child and how much work he had done after that. These people would have a heart attack if they knew about his past. It was a silly thought, but it made him smile despite the disappointing information. The conversation died a little after that response. However, the silence didn't last long as they entered a dining room. Its structure was very different from the ones back home. Rather than a single large table that they would sit around, it was a series of small tables spread into a large circle. There were gaps between each of the tables. The spacing seemed convenient, but he doubted that sharing would be very common with seating arrangements like this. There were far more seats than they needed, but Eiffel didn't do anything about it. Instead, she walked in casually moving beside the tables. His eyes went to the walls, and he noticed that it was surprisingly bare. There were green lights mixed into the wood there, but it wasn't anything special. What had surprised him was the way the lights seemed to shift. He watched it, mesmerized by how the wood of the room seemed strangely alive. It felt like it was a living, breathing entity, and he felt a temptation to take a bite. A sudden slapping sound surprised him, and he turned to face the noise. Eiffel had placed one hand against a wall and snapped her fingers. Mash watched as mana swelled around her and mixed into the tree above. He hadn't paid much attention to the ceiling but looked at it now. The ceiling had been blank a moment ago. The wood had been an unblemished blue like the trees from earlier. Flowers grew on the ceiling and turned into fruits as they fell to land on the tables. Soon each of the tables was piled with a stack of fruit. Mash had found something he really wanted to learn. He spent a lot on food as his hunger had been growing with his strength. If he could just make fruits grow from the wood that he made, that would solve the problem entirely. He was about to ask her about it but stopped when he heard a strange knocking sound echo in the room. It seemed like they would be meeting someone else. Chapter 159, Planning. Thankfully, the noise wasn't something dangerous, and I told them that they could keep eating. Don't worry about that. It's probably just my husband, Kirk. I'll get it, you guys just keep eating. It was pretty obvious that she probably wanted to warn the man of their presence, but Mash had the feeling that Kirk would know. The knocking had sounded a little urgent, so Mash guessed that he would know about it. Mash just took a seat at the nearest table and began eating some of the fruit. They looked mostly normal, although even the smallest of them was as large as his head. The fruit had a thin layer of skin and was covered in a mix of green and red. He took a bite of it, eating it without much care for things like seeds or the skin. It was pleasantly sweet, but the skin burned his tongue as a pepper would. The weird contrast actually made the fruit seem even sweeter. He didn't know how to eat it but didn't really feel like waiting. His hunger had already started to get the better of him, and he didn't hesitate to try another. The next he grabbed was hard and crunched in his mouth like he was chewing rocks. It was almost certainly the wrong way to eat the fruit, but he just kept at it. Eventually, he cleared his plate. The others were being more careful, only eating the fruits that seemed recognizable. Those weren't exactly the same as fruits from back home, but there was plenty that was close enough. They were saved from their struggle when returned to the room. Her husband was beside her, and he looked over the four of them carefully. Ifel's husband was surprisingly tall and was the bulkiest Vian that they had met thus far. Mash wouldn't consider him to be particularly muscular though, as even Luke had more muscles than him. He had oddly green hair, that was styled into two long spikes that were combed back and ran off the top of his head. Other than that, he had the same hooked nose that the rest of their people had, and the multicolored feathers attached to his arms. The colors looked brighter for some reason. It looked like the man was going to say something but didn't get to as Ifel looked over the tables. I forgot. I should have shown you how to eat the fruits. What happened to yours? She looked at the food they had eaten and saw Mash's empty plate. Her confusion was obvious, and Mash just tried to downplay it. I just ate everything. Can I get some more? He shrugged his shoulders, trying to express that this was normal to him. It didn't seem to change her perception though. She did snap her fingers again and more fruit began to form. This was the real reason he wanted seconds. While he was still a little hungry, he really wanted another opportunity to study her magic. Hopefully, Priscilla could capture the entire process. Her memory was perfect, and she certainly had the magical talent to replicate a spell. Some of the skins were poisonous. Ifel sounded a little apologetic, her voice trailing off as she didn't know how to continue. All four of them looked at her strangely. While Mash would be immune to poisons he consumed, the others didn't have such a benefit. It's nothing serious. The worst you can get is a twisted stomach. Kirk spoke quickly, obviously trying to save his wife from their scrutiny. Twisted stomach sounded nasty, but the way he spoke told him that it wasn't a big deal. It was probably no worse than a stomachache. Hearing that got the others to relax, and Mash just started eating his second serving of fruit. Ifel started teaching the others how to properly eat the fruit, and Mash watched from the corner of his eyes. It was something he should probably know if he was eating food outside. Kirk seemed ready to explode and constantly tried to get his wife's attention. He looked annoyed with her. Finally, he couldn't contain himself and just started speaking over his wife. Is fruit really the most important thing to be talking about right now? We need to tell them about the others. That pulled Mash's attention away from the fruit and the magic. He had been talking with Priscilla about recreating it, and he got some hopeful responses from her. Priscilla claimed that it would probably be a lot easier than trying to figure out telepathy. They were already used to the magic that grew things, and this seemed like a slightly more complex application of it. What do you mean others? Red asked the question, some obvious concern leaking into her voice. The concern was not directed toward the adventurers. Like him, the others were more worried for the natives than the adventurers. Not all adventurers were bad people, but they hadn't had many good experiences with them. Kirk was glad to get some attention, and he quickly began explaining the situation. While scouting, I spotted several adventurers entering the forest. I'm worried about what will happen if they find their way up here. They looked much more intimidating than these four. Kirk changed what he was going to say as he spoke, but they understood the meaning anyway. He obviously thought that the other adventurers looked stronger than them, though that was probably untrue. They were young and didn't have the same ruggedness that older adventurers possessed. There were a lot of reasons for that, but the biggest one was their age. Their high stats would help them act more like adults, but their bodies were actually aging more slowly now. With how fast they were gaining levels, they would probably always look like teenagers, but that wasn't so bad. Thinking about it that way, Mash wondered if he should really be trying to age more quickly. He could live with his appearance, and there was probably someone with the skill to change someone's appearance. He wondered why he had been so concerned about appearing young before. He already looked mostly like an adult, and that wouldn't change that much in a few years. I had actually come up with an idea for that. Have you guys seen any weird portals or gateways to other worlds? Any that just appeared recently? As she asked her questions, Kirk seemed to stiffen uncomfortably. It was obvious that he had some information on the matter. He fumbled with some sounds, and I spoke for him. Yes, there has been one that just appeared yesterday. How did you know? Our people do a lot to hide them. Finishing her response, eyes fell on Mash. She probably expected he had some involvement in the matter, but he just shook his head slightly. Red wanted to share her plan, and Mash had no intention of interrupting her. We're in the same situation back home. You can use that to get rid of us though. Most people here want to get out. If you lead them to it, they will probably just leave. So, try creating a trail for them to follow. Red's plan was simple and effective. Almost all the adventurers who had been waiting by the entrance would have been eager to leave. Honestly, Safa's group probably would have left given the opportunity. Their group was probably more used to hunting people outside of dungeons and had just been tempted by the bonus rewards new dungeons usually granted. Remembering them made him lose his appetite, and he stopped eating. Most of the food was gone anyway. Mash tried to change his focus and tried to come up with something to help. He made a wooden sign. It was like the one he had made earlier, but the text was different this time. I am an adventurer and have found the way out. Follow the path for an exit from the dungeon. Once the sign was finished, he held it for the others to see. Red nodded, and Mash explained what it said to Eiffel and Kirk. Just put this in front of the path you make. It will make it seem like I made it and am trying to help other people get out. Eiffel only nodded, but Kirk looked at it with a little suspicion. He probably expected Mash to betray them and try and take advantage of them. Eiffel could read the words though, and she reassured Kirk of the message. Kirk nodded his head. Thank you, I will get everything set up in the morning. Mash was about to ask Kirk why he would wait and remembered that no one would do any work at night. The very thought that he would delay for something like that baffled Mash, but he was not here to challenge their philosophies. Although, he was probably in the position to do it if he really wanted to. The rest of the meal went by quickly, and the group separated to go to bed. The room they had been in belonged to Eiffel and it was extremely large. Having several smaller rooms dedicated to her work within it. The four of them had received a similarly sized room across from hers. The way the building was designed, there were only 5 rooms on each floor. The room that his group had received was luxurious and had many bedrooms within it. There were enough rooms to fit another person if they needed it. They also had a dining room and kitchen, though they had nothing in them. A communal living space separated all of the bedrooms, and there were 2 bathrooms for the group. They were enormous bathrooms, made with the intention of fitting multiple people at once. Since their group was nicely split between guys and girls, each pair got a bathroom to themselves. The others were tired and just went straight to bed. However, Mash decided to take advantage of the luxurious baths. Unlike their world, these baths were large and filled with hot water constantly. He didn't know exactly what he was supposed to do, but mainly just wanted to relax in the hot water. Rather than immediately jumping into the water, he looked for something that resembled soap. The closest thing he found was some strange wax-like substance that smelled surprisingly nice. That looked good enough, and he used it to clean himself before entering the bath directly. Public baths usually worked like that, and he assumed that this would be the same. As he relaxed in the water, he found his mind wandering again. The real reason he had chosen to stay awake popped into his mind. He remembered the fight with Gerard and his near-death at the hands of Brock. It wasn't that he was afraid of death or dying. Well, he was, but that wasn't the problem for him. He had been in life and death scenarios a few times now, but those hadn't stuck as this one had. This reminded him of Leah rather than the demon. It was worse than both though. His fight with them had shown him how weak he was without his class. His whole goal so far had been to be free from that system, but only now did he realize what that could mean. Would he lose all his power? Was he willing to give up his power for his freedom? The questions frightened him. The weakness he had felt after getting the seal had disgusted him. Above all of the other things he wanted to get done, he wanted to find power that he could use without his skills. Plus, he wanted to make sure that he was always prepared for a fight. Priscilla, think you can teach me how to use magic without skills? You already can. The seal simply blocked all forms of mana usage. I think you need to prepare more before a fight starts. Monsters are strongest within their domains. The response felt like she was chastising him, but he accepted the advice. He had been confident that he could manage something in any situation. Although, she was right. He had ignored doing things like preparing things beforehand. Many ideas popped into his mind, as Priscilla sent him strategies he should have been employing. A lot of the things were stuff he had thought about before but had dismissed in his arrogance. With all the things he needed to do now, he doubted that he would be sleeping anytime soon. Chapter 160, Preparation. Mash went back to his room after finishing the bath. It was a nice experience and let him think about what he could do to prepare. He really should have done many of them already. Opening his storage space, Mash let his treant form cover him. He made an imitation of Priscilla, letting it maintain itself on its own mana. This was something he should test before but was glad to be doing it now. His creations drew on the ambient mana in the space around him, and he wondered if they would be able to do the same while in his storage space. Opening his storage space, caused some water to fall out. He had forgotten that he had used it to block an attack. 2 of the barrels inside had been broken, and the water rushed out as he opened it. Reacting quickly, he made a wooden creation to stop it from pouring into the rest of the room. The water quickly filled his room though, and he didn't really know what to do. His room had a window, so he opened it. The room was large, and the water only reached his calves. He walked over the window and looked out to see what he overlooked. He didn't notice anyone outside. He bent down, tearing a hole out of the wall beneath the window. The water immediately began pouring out, and he just hoped that no one walked under it. Looking at the piece of wood in his hands, he tossed the piece into his mouth. As expected, it tasted like wood, the bark crunching in his mouth. When he didn't feel anything change, he was a little disappointed. It had felt so alive earlier, and he had hoped that it would provide him with something. The room's floor was wood, and he would need to dry it. He didn't know what to do and decided to ask Eiffel in the morning. He had a bed in one corner, and a table on the other side. Both were a little wet, but they were big enough that they were mostly fine. He would need to let his sheets dry though. Grabbing them he hung them from the window, making sure to not let them touch the water that was still flowing out. That seemed good enough for now. Once he dealt with the water, he took stock of his supplies. The ration box that was open had been ruined, but the other ones were still fine. The boxes had some enchantment on them that helped with preservation, and that seemed to have resisted the water. If he properly sealed the one that he had opened, then the food wouldn't have gone to waste. Placing the imitation of Priscilla into the storage space, he closed it afterward and just waited a while. The imitation wasn't super large, so it would take a little bit for it to drain the mana inside. Thinking about it, he made several more objects and threw them into the storage space as well. He made a few of his sword staffs, as well as some normal ones. As he considered what else he could prepare, he made some javelins and tossed them inside as well. Objects that he made would decompose like his imitations even if they ran out of mana. He had noticed it before, but the mana just strengthened his normal creations. The lack of it wouldn't make them vanish. After he finished with it, he moved on to the next step of his plan. He made several imitations of Priscilla. They were very big, and he made over a dozen of them. Once he finished making them, he made another staff. He didn't make it bladed as he planned on carrying it with him during the day. In the past, he had wondered why people would carry their weapons on them when they could just use a storage space, but he understood now. Any fighter needed to prepare for any situation. Not being ready to fight was lazy. After making everything in his treant form, he returned to his human form. The thought made him freeze, as he realized that he considered his humanity to be another form. That was him, not something he was changing into. He couldn't forget what he was. Distracting himself from the thought, he made the imitations of Priscilla crawl into his sleeves. They coiled around his arms as if he was wearing strangely shaped arm guards. His room was large. Easily big enough that he could do some practice swings with the weapon. It had been a while since he relied on a weapon like this. He had been relying heavily on his magic and transformations, neither of which ever needed a weapon. The water sloshed a little as he moved about. The motions came automatically to him, and he found himself moving like he had when he had to fight using Endure. Cyclical attacks that relied on constant movement flowed through him as he swung the staff. Even if he didn't need to use the fighting style anymore, it was something he shouldn't forget. He should try mixing it more with how he fought now and learn to rely less on any one thing. Gerard had made that mistake, believing that his armor would be able to protect him from anything Mash could throw at him. To that end, he tried using the imitations of Priscilla with his attacks, making them swarm out as he spun. They could grow large enough to capture and eat things. Even if his skills were disabled, either he or Priscilla should be able to control them still. The rest of the morning was consumed by his practice. Only once he saw the first glimpses of light, did he remember to check his storage space. The imitation of Priscilla that had been inside was dissolved, but his weapons were still there. He had expected it to be the case but had wanted to test it anyway. It was a good thing to test either way. Storage spaces didn't create spaces that generated their own mana. Or maybe there were special kinds of spaces that could do so. He would need to investigate that, or maybe try and find an item that generated mana. The water had mostly drained at this point, only a few puddles remained on the ground. Stepping towards the door, he pried away from the wooden seal he had made. A little bit of water leaked out but not a lot. He had actually managed to work up a sweat in the hours of training and decided that he could probably do with another bath. However, this time he would go and ask Eiffel how to do it properly first. As he left his bedroom, he noticed that none of the others were awake yet. It made sense considering how late they had been up last night. Their room only had one exit, and he headed towards it. Opening the door, he stepped across the hallway. Eiffel's room was across from theirs, and he knocked on the door. The rooms had some system to let them hear the noise, so he expected her to come to answer him. The door opened, revealing Kirk. He stood stiffly, his back poised like a professional soldier. Mash looked at him for a second, thinking about how relaxed he had looked last night. He remembered that they acted differently during the day. Nodding to the man, Mash asked his questions. Can you show me how to use the baths? They are different than the ones back home. Kirk looked at him for a second, before replying with poorly held surprise. Your people don't have baths. The translation item that Eiffel had made would let him communicate with him so long as either of them was wearing one. He was glad for that, as he was able to explain what he had done last night and how his baths worked back home. After he finished, the man explained that what he did was mostly right. Apparently, Mash didn't need to wash off the waxy soap outside of the bath. He simply needed to cover himself with it and let the water of the bath wash it away. It was a magical construct and continuously cleaned itself. He just needed to enter and let the water do most of the work. Also, the wax would work just as well for his hair as anything else. Finally, he told Kirk to tell Eiffel that they would be practicing with the harmonicas later if she still wanted to join. Saying his goodbyes, Mash returned to his room. The conversation had gone well, but it was clear that Kirk was trying to be as respectful as possible. It would be much easier to talk to people once the sun went down, and he was slightly hesitant about going to a concert during the day. He could bring that up later and just went to take a bath. He followed the instructions he had received, managing to clean himself quickly. While he was soaking in the bath, Luke entered, and Mash started explaining how everything worked. Understanding, he began taking off his clothes. It was a little weird having someone undress nearby, but Mash tried to ignore it. However, he did notice a few scars on Luke's legs but didn't comment on it. He focused on the water, talking idly about random things. Luke noticed the imitations of Priscilla that he had resting by his staff and clothes. So, they talked a bit about what his plans were, and the things he had tested last night. You should probably give everyone a Priscilla bracelet or something. It will let us find you and send emergency signals if needed. Plus, they could help any of us if we are ever in that situation. He was right, of course, and Mash planned to do exactly that. As Mash thought about what Luke had said, he considered what else they could do as a group. We should probably figure out some things we can do before ever getting into a fight. That only made sense. Mash finished before Luke, but they got out at the same time. He waited a bit longer for Luke to finish, and they got changed quickly. As he put on his clothes, Mash let the wooden imitations wrap around his arms. After which he made 3 more and let one wrap around Luke's wrist. They left the bath and headed to the kitchen, surprised to find it stocked with more fruits and vegetables. He didn't notice any spices or meats and realized that these people probably didn't eat those kinds of things. The kitchen didn't even have all the equipment he expected. They had a device to both heat and cool things, but there was nothing to preserve food for a while. It seemed like they just made food whenever they needed it. Red and Jill came out eventually. They came out of the bath a bit after Mash and Luke and joined them around a pile of fruits. Snacking, Luke brought up what they had been discussing. After the recent fight, Mash and I think it would be a good idea to make some preparations. Do you guys have anything we can do before a fight even starts? He showed the Priscilla-shaped bracelet around his arm, and Mash made 2 more of imitation slither towards Red and Jill. Neither had a problem with it, and they let them coil around their wrists. Jill moved it to be around her bicep, as both her wrists were occupied. Red kept it as a normal bracelet like Luke. You guys could get some of my blood. I mean like a vial or something. Even as she spoke, the others had begun to stare at her warily. She picked up their looks and explained what she meant. Apparently, her blood could make them stronger but would poison them too. It shouldn't matter since Luke could heal them. Plus, if Mash drank it should just get the benefit while avoiding the cost because of his skills. It was a good idea, and they hoped they could find a good container for the purpose. It was something though, and Mash felt a little more prepared to face another situation like with Safa.